All right. Hello, everyone,
Ah,
and welcome to this edition of PON Live from the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. I'm Nicole Bryant, the Managing Director here at the Program on Negotiation, and it is my great honor and pleasure to welcome all of our participants joining us, we know from all across the world, to today's event in celebration of Robert Malley's newest book, which we will be introducing in just a moment. For those of you who are joining this event for the first time, the Program on Negotiation is a research group dedicated to the practice and focus on negotiation, mediation, and conflict resolution. And for 40 years, we have led research, curriculum development, and executive trainings related to these topics, as well as a variety of outreach events such as this one, portraying subjects related to our chosen fields of study from distinguished speakers joining us from the world over. Before I introduce today's moderators and our speaker, I would like to thank the PON staff who does so much work setting up this event and all of the events that we host over the course of the year. Today, special thanks to Laura San Pietro, Ken Russell, and Luis Reyes for everything that they've done behind the scenes. During today's event, our moderators will be asking questions of our speaker for about 35 minutes. And at the conclusion, we will, of course, provide a moment for Q&A from our audience members. So if you have a question at any time during the presentation, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen in order to input a question, which will be posed to our speaker. I will also note that this program is being recorded, so if you need to step out at some point, or if you'd like to review or share with a friend, it will be put up on the PON website in a couple of days for you to view. And with that, my last task is to introduce our fabulous moderators. I'll ask that I be unspotlighted so I can appropriately highlight my wonderful colleagues and PON faculty members. We have two moderators today for this wonderful event, Professors Robert Mnookin and James Sebanius. Both of longtime members and important figures in the program of negotiation. I will start with Professor Mnookin, who was for many years the chair of the program on negotiation and still very active. I got to see him just in a classroom teaching on mediation just yesterday. And he is now an emeritus professor at Harvard Law School and still sits on the executive committee of the program on negotiation. He's joined by his colleague Jim Sebanius, the Gordner Donaldson Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School, as well as a vice chair for practice-focused research here at the program on negotiation. And now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over the Zoom floor first, I believe, to Professor Sebanius to introduce today's event and our speaker. Jim?
Nicole, thank you, and thanks to the PON staff for making this possible, and even more to Rob Malley, who is joining us, and it's a great privilege for us. By way of introduction, though people will perhaps have read some of the background on this webinar, Rob has spent more than 3 decades literally at the center of some of the most complex and emotionally charged conflicts in modern geopolitics. He was trained as a lawyer, educated at Yale, Harvard, and Oxford, and he's been really from an early age or from an early stage of his career as a very thoughtful, principled analyst of Middle Eastern politics. And his work reflects the conviction, I think, really distinctively that understanding another community's history and grievances is virtually a prerequisite for lasting peace. And as by way of roles across the Clinton, Obama, and Biden administrations, he served in key national security and diplomatic roles. He was a senior negotiator at the 2000 Camp David Summit, architect of the U.S. policy during the Arab Spring, a lead negotiator of the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and most recently, the U.S. Special Envoy for Iran. Outside the government for 14 years, he was at the International Crisis Group, which he headed for a period of time. And that's really one of the world's most respected conflict resolution organizations. Now, he has written a book very recently. Tomorrow is Yesterday. I recommend it to you highly. And in it, he has argued and really stressed the fact that diplomacy shouldn't be a technical enterprise, but be grounded in a deep appreciation of narrative, of memory, of emotion. And those often lie beneath the surface of the formal negotiations, but really influence the choices that people make. And he listens to everybody, all sides, and even that sometimes carries political risk. Um, these days, he's teaching at the Jackson School at Yale. And Rob, it's just a pleasure to welcome you to PON Live, where I and my colleague Bob Manukin would love to start the process by asking you a few questions. So let me turn it over to Bob.
Rob, what a pleasure to have you again here in Cambridge and participating in this Harvard event. My first question goes to the title of the book. Tomorrow is Yesterday, Life, Death, and the Pursuit of Peace in Israel-Palestine. What's clear to me is that the subtitle describes well the subject matter of your book, which is the conflict between Israel, Palestine, Palestinians, and the Arab countries. Uh, my question really goes to the title, though, and its meaning. Tomorrow is yesterday, which I think very much goes to the theme of the book. And I wonder if you could share with us your thoughts about why you chose that as the title and what it means to you.
First, Bob and Jim, it's really a pleasure. I'm delighted to be here with you. We've known each other on and off for years, and I have huge respect for everything you've done in terms of exploring and delving into the whole world of negotiation. And so thanks so much for having me. It's a good place to start because the title of the book tells the story of the book and tells the story of why Hussein Agha, with whom I co-wrote the book and with whom I've cooperated on dozens of articles over the years, because what the book basically its message is that what we're living today, and particularly since October 7th, but not just, is not something new, anomalous, sort of coming from outer space. What happened on October 7th and the savage war that followed, neither the massacres of October 7th nor the slaughter that followed are sort of one-offs, aberrations. And they very much are reenactments of the past, and everything that we've seen for the recent years and over recent years and in obviously in recent decades are throwbacks, echoes of the essence of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. And as a sub-theme to that, which I'm sure we'll get into, is what it says about the years of the peace process that Hussein and I have been involved in, myself on the American side, Hussein on the Palestinian side, that if we are now back where everything began in terms of the raw, brutal contest between Israelis and Palestinians, after all these years of a peace process that was supposed to lead to a two-state solution, it tells us something about how flimsy, how unreal, how superficial that peace process was, and how little it delved into the real, the core of the conflict between the two sides. So, as we say in the book, everything from the dynamics between the two sides, the language, even the terminology that people are using, which we could get into: genocide, Holocaust, Nakba, Zionism is racism, settler colonialism. The vernacular itself, the language, is an echo or throwback to the past. And by the way, I'll end on this, even what we're living now with the Trump peace plan and this establishment of some kind of semi-trusteeship without consultation with the Palestinians, all that too, if evidence or more proof are needed of how we're reliving the past, that peace plan and what it entails and how it's been brought about is also a throwback to the past.
Well, I want to turn the next question over to Jim. Actually, one brief additional question, and that is, given the relevance of the past, share with us what you think are the key elements of the narratives of the Israelis, Palestinians, and Arabs.
Well, we don't have all that much time, so I'll try to be very brief. But certainly from a Palestinian point of view, and again, when we describe why the negotiations failed, a lot of it has to do with the very different framings of at least the two main sides, and we could bring in the Americans, which tended to endorse one narrative over the other, the American negotiators. But from a Palestinian point of view, the fundamental injustice, 1948, even before that, when the British mandatory power allowed Jewish immigration without consultation with the original or with the existing inhabitants, and that their land was taken away, and the population, large percentage of the population of the Palestinians were forced to flee, and that's the sort of the original sin, and the original sin that colors everything that happened since, including the peace proposals that were made. They were judged against that experience that the Palestinians have had of having been dispossessed of their land, dispossessed of everything, and being sort of the targets of machinations by outside powers. Now, the Israeli, or at least the Israeli Jewish experience and their perspective is very different, right? They believe they are returning to their ancestral homeland, but even beyond that, they feel like they accepted they accepted a two-state solution, and therefore the division of what they believe is their ancestral homeland, and were attacked by the Palestinians in 1948, by the Arabs in 1948, and time again, whatever they did, whether it was compromising, offering a compromise, or withdrawing from territory, Lebanon or in Gaza or elsewhere, that they are the object of attacks, which and both those perspectives give rise to a very different sense of what is a compromise. For the Palestinians, the historical compromise is agreeing to the division of the land and to two-state solution on the borders of 1967, because their original aspiration, continued aspiration, in fact, went to the line between the river and the sea. But when they agreed to a compromise in which they would only hold on to the borders of 1967, they believe that's a historic compromise. Obviously, for the Israelis, they believe that their compromise is acquiescing in the return of any land, because they won in what they consider to be a war waged by their enemies, and from their perspective, from the Israeli perspective, when in history does a party that was attacked, that emerged from that attack victorious, that acquired more land as a result of the attack that was perpetrated by their opponents, when in history is that country has it turned over land out of their generosity or magnanimity? And so you have a very, very different perspective, different narrative, competing worldviews from both sides. And part of the challenge of the peace process has been to reconcile, and they failed to do that, those competing narratives.
Rob, you argue, I think, eloquently that the conflict's core is much less about territory and much more about identity and historical grievance and the narratives, as you just, briefly summarized them. And yet the framework that has been offered, and the U.S. has been central in that, one state, confederation, two states, these tend to be highly structural approaches. And with the conviction that your book, I think, eloquently lays out, that the best guide to the future is what happened yesterday, what accounts for the fact that you and others persisted so long with, one of these structural solutions, the sort of two states, when there were so many conditions kind of undermining it or inconsistent with, the core of the issue? Could you help understand that?
Yeah, and again, part of what Hussein and I say, relate in the book, is how we ourselves were very allergic to the notion that you had to bring in history, that you had to bring in 1948, that, the neat solution, the one that made rational sense, that sort of was the arithmetic, mathematical solution, is to say, well, you have a conflict, let's define it as having more or less begun in 1967. I'm oversimplifying even the dominant perspective at the time, but say, Israel should hold on to the land that it had before 1967 and turn over to the Palestinian, to West Bank and Gaza, find some security arrangement that would allow Israelis to feel safe, and divide Jerusalem in a way that would kind of respect both sides' narratives. And by taking a pen and trying to draw that on a map and trying to find clever formulations that would address some of the issues of Jerusalem, or even the issues of the refugees, by treating them not particularly as fundamental to the conflict, but as things that you just had to deal with. Now you ask why, and the reason is it seemed, and I'm going to use the word a bit too quick, too superficial. It seemed easy. It seemed neat. It's a neat solution. I made that case for years that you could find a way to balance the competing interests of both sides, born of the 1967 occupation, in ways that fundamentally would give what both sides wanted. Now, there's so many assumptions and presumptions in that statement that turned out to be false, but you can understand why, and you've both been in negotiations, it's often the shortcut that people go to. And again, I could speak, I think, for both Hussein and myself. We were of the school of thought that felt that when people came to us and said, well, what about 1948? What about the Nakba? What about the refugees? What about the Israeli insistence that they be recognized as a Jewish state? What about all the memories that they bring? We would say, fine, deal with those after you've reached a peace deal. Let's reach the peace deal, and then you could, deal with these more amorphous, complicated emotional issues. But those more amorphous, complicated, abstract emotional issues, those were the conflict. I mean, that's what, again, the trajectory of the book is and what it tries to convey is that is the conflict. You can't say let's ignore the conflict in order to resolve the conflict, right? And so, as we argue, there may have been times where with a different U.S. policy pressures and Palestinians acquiesce in the two-state solution as it's been defined, sort of rigid sovereignties and sort of ethno-national states. But that was never really what the conflict was about for its main protagonists. And if you really wanted to find a sustainable outcome, we had to, the negotiators and the parties had to deal with things that were much more uncomfortable because they related to deep-seated emotions and history and aspirations and yearnings that are hard to sum up by drawing a line on a map or words on a piece of paper. You have to deal with something that's much more fundamental, much more intrinsic. Again, from a negotiating point of view, that's much harder to do. But if we haven't learned from the repeated failures of the past 30 or more years that the easy way is not the right way, then we haven't learned anything.
Your book is I think brilliantly diagnostic, and yet at the same time, the kinds of solutions, whether it's two states or a confederal agreement or a confederal arrangement, or they're a range of creative possibilities, but none of them really address what I think you and Hussein argue is core to this conflict. And yet, if I look at other conflicts in the world, if I look at Northern Ireland, for example, or South Africa, or maybe less South Africa, but in Aceh and Indonesia, or some of these places, the deals don't really address the deeper aspirations of the sides. They have the virtue of greatly reducing the violence and the symptoms of these, but not fundamentally reconciling or somehow engaging these. And is that the best that can be done? Or do you, because I understand that structural solutions to deeper problems can't be satisfactory, but are some of them better than what was otherwise possible? Because it's hard to even understand quite what that sort of engagement would be. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
So there's a lot in what you just said, and I'm going to try to deconstruct what your question. So first of all, I don't know that in our book we say that all these other outcomes, confederation between Israel and Palestine, different forms of more porous sovereignty, that those wouldn't address those core issues. In fact, we say you may be able, if you break away from the straitjacket of the strict two-state solution, right? And many formats of two-state solutions that one can imagine, but the one that has been predominant in the negotiations, that if you break away from that, then maybe you'll find a way to address questions of history and emotions. And so we do get into that. That's one point I make. The second point is, there are many different conflicts. Every conflict at some level is sui generis, although I'm sure there's a lot of commonalities among them. But so I'm not claiming that what we say about Israel-Palestine would be true about Aceh, would be true about Myanmar, would be true about South Africa or Ireland. Again, I think there's some lessons that are more universal, but the point we're making is really about this conflict and what it says about what the failures to resolve it say about the misdiagnosis of this conflict. And if you don't know the nature of the conflict that you're trying to resolve, no effort is going to succeed in resolving. So that's how I'd answer it. That as you said, when I was at the head of crisis group, I'd have to look at very different conflicts. Again, I would always find similarities. I'd find deep differences. There's something special about every conflict, and there's something unique about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in terms of the history and the emotions that it has, that it summons, not just among Israelis and Palestinians, but worldwide. Just look at the global attention, the global focus on this conflict and the passions that it unleashes, and that's something that is quite unique. So I'm not sure that referring to other conflicts and there are lessons to be learned. We mentioned, for example, that one of the keys to resolving, it seems to us that the conflict in Northern Ireland has been the acceptance of the fact that both sides would stick to their narratives and neither side was going to give up its dreams, right? Mm-hmm. Now the Protestants and Catholics had to give up ultimate aspiration, whereas in the traditional negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, the core demand, Israeli demand has been, an American demand has been, whatever we resolve has to be an end of conflict, end of claims. That's it. We're not going to reopen anything else. Once you sign on to this piece of paper, that is it. And that was something that was very hard, in particular for the Palestinians to digest, because they were being told, not just is the refugee issue not going to be truly seriously addressed in this deal, whether it was Camp David or afterwards, but we're telling you, you're never going to address it. We're foreclosing that possibility. And again, the Israelis did it, and one could understand why. Their fear was, we accept this two-state solution, and then a year or two, 10 years later, the Palestinians are going to say, well, what about the refugees? And what about the Palestinian citizens of Israel? We want to bring that into the equation, and so we won't have Palestinian state and a Jewish state. We're going to have two Palestinian states. Again, that's the refrain one heard, and I believe that the Israelis really feared this. So they took this view that this had to be the end, finality of claims, finality of the settlement. And that was something that, as I say, was very hard for the Palestinians to accept, because how do they sell it to more than half of the Palestinian population, which doesn't live in the West Bank or Gaza, and whose aspirations and yearnings would not be fulfilled? So there was something in that Northern Ireland's outcome that, when we discussed it with Israelis and Palestinians in some of the track two efforts, they were drawn to. So that's how I'd answer the question. I think there are ways of there must be ways of trying to address and to some extent satisfy those deeper emotions, certainly superior to what was tried in the past.
Bob?
I wanted make an observation of a broader implication for mediators generally of your book, because I think there's a lot to your argument, and I think you're quite correct that a common stance of mediators, in fact, yesterday at PON, I was sharing and teaching what's a 5-day mediation course, and I was modeling how I would begin a mediation. And I asked each party to tell their story of what happened, what were the sources of the problem. And afterwards, one of the students said, "Why in the world did you ask that question? You understood that there were going to be two radically different narratives, and they're never going to agree about entirely what happened." And I said, well, I think they may not agree, but a key aspect, I think, of resolution is often ensuring that the disputants understand the perspective of the other side. And if you never talk about it, or you shove it under the rug, that's not going to happen. And so I think your book is a very helpful reminder that although it's unlikely the parties are going to agree about the interpretation of what happened in the past, for them to each understand at a deep level those differences, I think for any kind of deep reconciliation, that's necessary.
Yeah.
And yet
So,
mediators often say, let's exclude it. Let's focus on the future. How are we going to fix the particular problem? I think it's a very common problem. So I
I'm
think
really glad you said that, 'cause I'm going to a little bit contradict what I said in response to Jim's question, which is about sort of the relevance of what we say beyond Israel-Palestine. As we say at the very beginning of the book, this is an essay on emotions, on fear, on dreams, on yearnings, on dispossession, on life and death, which is what so many conflicts are about. And as you say, it is, and I think you mentioned it in the introduction, or Jim did, that for me, one of the trademarks of negotiations is putting yourself in everyone's shoes and understanding the world through their perspective, which is why I appreciated your first question about what was the prism through which Israelis and Palestinians tried to do in government. I certainly tried to do at the International Crisis Group. That was trademark, right? Which is talk to each side and try to, don't have to accept, agree, endorse, but at least understand why they might view the world the way they view it and why they may view their claims the way they do it. And I think that's, other than being something that's fascinating and that I always find rewarding, it's something that I think is essential if you're going to be an effective mediator or an effective negotiator. And one thing I'd say about what you said earlier, they may not ultimately agree. We mention this anecdote in the book. It really is something that Hussein, through his experience, learned. That, and it goes also to some of the flaws of mediation. You know, most of the discussions, negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, the negotiators were people who the US felt comfortable with. Sort of the moderates, quote unquote, I hate that term, moderate Palestinians, moderate Israelis, put them in a room and they spoke a language that the US was more comfortable with. They raised issues that the US was more familiar with. And they failed, right? In the end, they weren't able to reach a solution, in part because the US tended to pick those that they thought were more likely to find a common ground, but that didn't make them necessarily more representative of their respective societies, more able to carry large swaths of their people, the communities with them. But that is a flaw, I think, not just of the US, but in particular of the US, which is to look for people who look, speak, and act like them to negotiate with. But one of the experiences that Hussein has, and we spell in the book, is that at some point we tried to bring together more, again, a term I hate, radical or extreme or whatever, representatives of both sides, more Islamist or representative of the refugee diaspora community on the Palestinian side, religious Zionists or settlers on the Israeli side. And one thing they told us at the end, both of them separately, was how refreshing they found those discussions, more honest, because even though they didn't agree, they respected the fact that the other side had the same attachment, identity-like attachment, emotional attachment to all of the land that they had. And they found sort of a common language, despite the gulf that separated them. And the Palestinians in particular said, you know, these Palestinians at least said, we prefer speaking to these Israelis who don't have that attitude of saying, yeah, we understand you and we know that, you know, what you want is a state on the borders of 67. No, it's not really what they wanted. What they wanted was something very different, more, as I said, more amorphous. And the Israeli right, if that's the right term, had that same appreciation. And the Israelis also told us, you know, at least we have Palestinians who are speaking a language that we found was more authentic and truthful. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy to find an outcome, but whatever conversations they had were truer, more authentic than some of the ones that were more contrived and more designed to please the Americans who happened to be in the room.
that observation of yours also leads to a broader question that Jim and I have focused on and are very interested in, and that is often a critical aspect of disputes like this are the conflicts behind the table within a community or within a company.
Yeah.
And I think that what's striking about this one is that, of course, the internal conflicts among Palestinians is profound. and conflict and makes the leadership issue of how you create and sell a quote resolution extremely difficult. And the same, of course, is true on the Israeli side. Multiple political parties, often razor-thin margins in the parliament. And I think that a sub-theme of your book is that the participation at the table, so to speak, was much too narrow. And that the
I mean,
and that without progress on the behind the table conflicts, it was unlikely you could really have progress at the table.
yeah, so great, very good point. On the Israeli side, as we say, half a dozen Israels. I mean, half of the Knesset doesn't really has a different view about the state of Israel. Each half has a very different view if you count the religious Orthodox and the Palestinian citizens of Israel. But you also have different communities, and you have so it's a very fragmented society, as we see. Comes together in moments of crisis with the Palestinians, but otherwise it is deeply divided about its views on everything. And on the Palestinian side, and here it's not just that there's a conflict behind the conflict and we ignore it, is that not just the Americans, the international community, or the West and Israel exacerbated that conflict behind the conflict, thinking sometimes, at least on the American side, let's only deal with those Palestinians who speak the kind of language we want to hear. And let's exclude the others. And that's the way we're going to resolve the conflict. But again, those others were the conflict. And in some ways, they were more representative, if not more representative, more dynamic, more able to torpedo the process. And so by exacerbating the divisions between Fatah and Hamas, by saying, only one side is the one that we want to anoint and appoint as a negotiator, standing in the way after having encouraged the elections in 2006 that Hamas won, then going out of our way to make sure that there wouldn't be new elections, that Hamas would be excluded, that we'd have all these conditions for them to be part of the dialogue, and threatening the Palestinian Authority and the Palestine Liberation Organization with all manner of sanctions if they reconcile with Hamas. Again, only playing into the hands of those in power on the Fatah Palestinian Authority side who didn't want to have to reconcile because reconciliation would have meant sharing power. So the divisions were not just a reality, they were a reality that were promoted, exacerbated by the outside world. In a way that was wholly illogical. Again, you cannot make peace between parties that you pre-select and pre-anoint. You make peace between the parties that are in conflict, that are at war, and in this case, the parties that were in conflict and were at war were also those that the Americans didn't want to deal with. And that's why we say, if you want to reinvent this process, and there's so much that's going to need reinvention, opening the aperture, bringing to the table some of those forces, some of those social constituencies and political constituencies and religious constituencies that have been held at bay and have been excluded is going to be necessary.
This question of too narrow a representation, as well as neglecting what Bob, I think, focuses on as the behind the table questions. It's, diplomats often, and I think this is the case with many of the American diplomats involved, really wanted to exclude things from the process, not just the people, but subjects and considerations that if brought in, it was feared that it would be irreconcilable in the sense, especially religion. If you bring that in and make a religious conflict as opposed to a secular Palestinian Authority, and that you've just guaranteed that it can't possibly work. And yet by excluding it, I think you and Hussein make the case that that almost was another way of dooming it to. I'd actually like to move to a much more micro question, if I may, because you served in, the Clinton, Obama, and Biden administration. You were deeply involved in the process, and from your perspective, is there one or a couple of decisions or assumptions that you personally regret the most, that if you could turn back the clock, what you would do differently? Understanding you were part of a team, you were part of an administration, you didn't, it wasn't your process to decide, although you could influence it. What would such a decision or a moment be beyond the sort of broader assessment that we've been looking at a more macro view thus far in our conversation.
And where to begin, Jim? This has I've only regret since other than the Iran deal, most all of the other negotiations I was a party to, Israel-Palestine, Israel-Syria. I was part of the negotiations between the U.S. and Russia trying to end the Syrian civil war. All of them failed. So hard for me to not have a long compilation of regrets in that sense. I do want to make just parenthesis to your earlier point, which is absolutely right. I mean, this narrow concept was not just we've selected certain issues, the participants, Israeli and Palestinian participants, but also the outside actors. There was almost a U.S. monopoly at the exclusion, in particular, of Arab countries, and the notion that one could resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict without Arab involvement was unrealistic from day one. But putting that aside, I don't know where to start. The fundamental mistake at Camp David, if you want to start in 2000, is to decide that was going to be the summit, the be all and end all. That this is where, in a 2-week process, we were going to resolve everything. We started it late. It should have started years earlier. And then we tried to rush it. And then we announced, because that was Ehud Barak, the Israeli prime minister at the time's sort of preference, but more than a preference, it was sort of his condition, was that either we resolved it in those 2 weeks, or the Palestinians were going to be demonized, they were going to be the pariah, they were going to be responsible for the breakdown, and we were not going to continue the effort. That was a extraordinarily harmful decision, which I regret not speaking out against at the time. But again, as you say, I was one. I'm not sure that it would have made all that much of a difference. But I do think that there are times when one should speak one's mind, even if it's not going to make that much of a difference. And I think at that point, it really did lead to catastrophic outcome. I could go on about sort of other things in the Obama administration, which don't even have to do necessarily with Israel-Palestine. But again, I don't want to take all the time with all the negatives, but I do think,
well, that's helpful.
I think it raises, of course, another question for those, if there's students who are watching and listening. You could voice your view even when you know that it's not going to prevail. And you could do it 1 time, you could do it 2 times, you could do it 3 times. At some point, you have to ask your question whether you are doing it in a way that is so undermining your credibility, because your bosses are going to say, I don't want to hear this guy. Tell me again why they want to do it a different way from the way we have decided we're going to do it. And you have to decide, are you prepared to sacrifice that credibility, or are you prepared to stay quiet and not voice your views, or do you resign? And I think those are questions that anyone who's listening, who's thinking of a career in government, whether it's the US government or any other government, has to grapple with, because it's never going to be a government that is 100% in agreement with your views. It often is going to be in disagreement, and sometimes vehement disagreement with your preferences. And that's an ethical and political decision that you have to make. At what point is the disagreement simply too great for you to continue serving?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, because so many of the students that Bob and I and our colleagues on the program on negotiation and its component schools, MIT and professional schools at Harvard, the Fletcher School at Tufts, Brandeis, so many of the students who are keen in negotiation, and especially in the diplomatic realm, see themselves as and they know they'll be parts of teams, and they know that this will be the kinds of choices that they'll have to face. So seeing it sharply from your experience, we've got a lot of interesting questions from the audience, although Bob and I could monopolize this, but maybe I can start by just sharing one of them with you, that the focus thus far has been an American-dominated peace process, and you've laid out the limited results, even failure, that has had. And the question from one of our audience members is, what would a more multilateral or regionally led process involving Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the EU, even China look like? And what might the unique advantages or disadvantages of that might they present?
I mean, this advantage is one of the reasons why the U.S. always steers clear of. I mean, unless it's a conflict they don't care that much about, because it's more unwieldy, and you have parties that might invoke, bring in issues or standards or international law, something that's just going to, quote unquote, complicate the effort. Whereas always seems easier if you have fewer hands on deck. I mean, that's just, and having been in the room, I could see why uh, more often than not, there is the temptation to say, we'll call you when we need you, which is exactly what the US did. For just to take the example of Camp David, it was a decision that the US made, but pushed by the Israelis. No Arab participation, no European participation, except at the very end when things were on the verge of collapse. Suddenly, the Israelis and we decided, well, the Israelis encouraged us, and President Clinton decided to pick up the phone and call some Arab leaders saying, we need your help to press Arafat to agree to a deal that we haven't even briefed you on. I mean, it was that absurd. There was a few days left, and called King Hussein and President Mubarak and others, and King and the Saudi monarch, and say, we need your help. But by then it was too late, and they had not been involved before. So it does come with, it's more unwieldy, it's more disorganized, it could go in all kinds of directions, but it means that you have a greater ability to introduce elements of leverage, incentives, disincentives. I mean, just again, to look at where we are, just small, so not talking about every actor, but just Arab actors to try to get this so-called truce or ceasefire in Gaza. You needed that. You needed Turkey, you needed Qatar, you needed Egypt. And again, given particularly today, the state of the Palestinian national movement, which we could spend hours talking about, the state of disrepair and how adrift they are and how unrepresented the Palestinian people are today. How could you have a serious negotiation if you don't have Arab countries involved? Just because the Palestinians are going to need that support and that succor, but also on the Israeli side, because the Palestinians don't have much to offer the Israelis, right? I mean, Israelis could say, we can live with the Palestinians as they are today. What could they give us? They can't give us security. We could do this on our own. We'll deal with it, and we'll continue to control the land. To the extent they want something from the Arab world, is that they want normalcy, they want the normalization, normalcy, recognition, acceptance, and that's something that's an asset that the Arab world and the Muslim world could give them, not the Palestinians on their own can't. So there's a lot that the outside world could provide. Again, I'm not saying that this should be a free-for-all where the entire world gets involved, but given the inability of the US on its own to do it, and it is, credit where credit is due, President Trump, for all his flaws, and there's so many, including in the deal that he just struck, but he was more open to bringing in some of the neighboring countries, and that made a difference in getting this so-called ceasefire over the finish line.
Another question relates to, in your view, what's to become of Hamas and Fatah in the future?
So it is something that we talk about in the book. And again, you asked first why the title. It is Tomorrow's Yesterday in the sense that you have a Palestinian people whose national movement is completely, as I said, adrift, at a loss, and the Palestinians are in need of a reinvented Palestinian leadership, just as was the case after the Nakba in 1948. Now, Fatah and Hamas may survive, as we say in the book, but if they do, it will be in a profoundly transformed way. I think Fatah has lost so much credibility over the years. It's hard to even identify what its program is, what its leadership is, what it signifies, and what has it achieved, right? I mean, it had one goal, which was liberation, whatever that meant, return, whatever that meant, and it's achieved neither. In some ways, it has ended up being, insofar as it is now at the helm of the Palestinian Authority, in the eyes of many Palestinians, a subcontractor to the occupation that is providing more security, and a very uneven one at that, to the Israelis and to the Palestinian people. And Hamas, it may well survive as well, because there's always been an Islamist current in the Palestinian national consciousness and its own polity. But it will have some real reckoning in the wake of October 7th, because if it had a plan to provoke Israel and succeeded in, quote unquote, in provoking Israel, it had no plan to deal with the inevitable response to that provocation, and it wasn't able to defend the Palestinian people. It wasn't able to defend Gaza, and so both legs of the Palestinian movement have real accounting to do, because they have not been able to meet the basic needs of the Palestinian people. Where that leads, I don't know. Is there some form of reconciliation? Is there some new Palestinian movement that emerges, I'm not in a position to tell, but certainly there's a crisis, the likes of which the Palestinians, in terms of representation in their national movement, they've not experienced for decades.
We have another of our of the audience.
Sorry, if I just add one thing
Please.
to that. And when I was a student of national liberation movements. You cannot, the notion that the Palestinians can reach their goals, or even that they can negotiate, that outsiders could pick Palestinians to negotiate their fate without a unified representative Palestinian movement is an illusion, right? And so I think even for the sake of people who believe that they want negotiations, but they dislike one side or the other, the Palestinian national movement, the notion that you're going to get Palestinians to negotiate their future without some form of unified, representative, credible national movement is a sham.
Very useful addition to this. Another of our audience members says that I am a long time on the ground peace worker in the region. Where are the women in this story? Where should they be?
So talk about exclusion. You're absolutely right. I mean, I recall trying to. Well, there's some women who've been involved in both sides, but the vast majority have been men. I don't want to start naming names, but of course that's ultimately going to be what Israelis and Palestinians are going to have to make their own decisions about who they want to see at the negotiating table to represent them, and the notion of having more inclusive representative leadership on both sides is something that cuts across all these themes.
So again, thinking of that in terms of exclusion, it's several questions here have to do with, again, the regional piece of the story, because as you said, there's a view among maybe even the median Israeli who's moved to the right that the Palestinians just don't have all that much to offer that the Israelis can't do themselves. And so the potential and maybe even the necessity of regional players and the prospect of quote unquote normalization, does that offer a significant opportunity to improve the situation there and improve the chances of negotiation, at least at this point?
So I start with where you started. It is true right now, and this notion that American officials have repeated as a truism that the status quo is unsustainable. Nothing has been more sustainable than the status quo. And from an Israeli perspective, one could understand both that the status quo has been quite beneficial. They've been able to maintain the occupation without huge cost to their security, other than there are moments like October 7th, but for the most part, they've been able to deal with security threats. They've been able to have obviously good relations with much of the outside world, and much of those relations were actually improving pre-October 7th, despite the absence of a resolution of the Palestinian question. So as I've said, President Obama once observed to us that what is irrational is to expect Israel to behave differently. It's not when the incentive structure is no different. So the irrational ones are not the Israelis. The irrational ones are those that expect that Israel is going to change course. And by the way, as I said at the beginning, the Israeli perception, one could dispute it, is that when they do take steps that they believe are more forward-leaning in terms of withdrawing from southern Lebanon, or withdrawing from Gaza, or making the offer that they believe they made at Camp David, each time they believe that the response has been more violence. Camp David, the Second Intifada, southern Lebanon, Hezbollah rockets and missiles, Gaza rockets and missiles, and then October 7th. So really that incentive structure needs to change if Israel is going to move in a different direction. Some of this has to do with what the outside non-Arab world can do in terms of incentives and disincentives, cost that Israel would incur for perpetuating the status quo. Part of it, as you said, on the Arab side is offering Israeli something that the Zionist movement has wanted from the beginning, which is a normalcy, acceptance, recognition by the outside world and by the Arab world in particular. So in that sense, the Abraham Accords and the notion of normalization between Arab countries, Muslim countries, and Israel, there's something there, right? There's a germ of something, a seed of something that is quite important. Now, the way it was handled so far, Israel has not had to do much other than, say that it wouldn't formally annex the West Bank, even as it moves de facto towards annexation, as the price for normalization with the UAE. If this process is going to continue, one would hope that Palestinians would work closely with those Arab countries that have yet to normalize and have steps in it that would be truly meaningful for the Palestinian. One thinks in particular of eventual Saudi-Israeli normalization, which I assume is only a matter of time. But one would hope that that Saudis and Palestinians would work more closely than certainly any of the other Abraham Accord countries work with the Palestinians to try to come up with something that would yield meaningful progress for Palestinians. So there's an opportunity there. It's not an opportunity that has been particularly well exploited to date, but there's always hope that it can be dealt with in a more productive way in the future. And as you say, there is at this point, other than the disincentives, whatever sanctions or leverage that the outside world could impose on Israel, the incentive would be that Israel would be in a position of greater normalcy and greater recognition by its neighbors, and for that, the concession or the price they would have to pay, if that's the right word, would be progress on the Palestinian front.
Yeah, as negotiation types, we always ask the question, is there a zone of possible agreement that's better for both sides, how they see their interests broadly construed? Is there a zone of possible agreement? And there's a case that there really isn't if you draw the circle too narrowly, as between Israelis and Palestinians, and hence the potential for outside. There's several other external questions, and Bob, you might want to choose some of these, but one that struck me as interesting is every day both sides wake to what even can be thought of as new narratives of yesterday. Post October 7th, or because of everything since October of 2023. And that while that makes things much more acute, the question the audience member asked, what have you learned about how third parties in this conflict should either try to keep up the process or, after a big event like this, almost start over in what they can do?
So first, we could spend a lot of time about how the outside world has been virtually, wholly ineffective in stopping what an increasing number of organizations, experts, historians are called a genocide. And so I think that, before they think about what they can do to relaunch the process, there should be some introspection about how they allowed on their watch. That's true certainly of the United States under the Biden and Trump administration, but also of Europe and others who were complicit in the atrocities that occurred. And I think that's, again, before we jump to the next step, that's something that merits some reflection and some, as I say, some introspection and accountability. I think the second thing, and this is something Hussein and I have written about, is we're hearing a number of countries now saying, okay, we had that terrible, awful October 7th and what followed. So now we need to go back to resume the pursuit of a two-state solution, resume the peace process. We say, hold on. As in response to your first question, I said, and we write in the book, that neither October 7th nor the war that followed were aberrations, were ruptures from the past. They are the culmination of a process that fed. You can't divorce October 7th and what happened afterwards from everything that happened before. The failures, the misconceptions, the mishandling, everything that went wrong. And so to say now we got to go back and resume the two-state solution, the pursuit of a two-state solution, as if, again, what we've seen is not the utter indictment of the pursuit and the way it was pursued, and not take some time before rushing to, as I said earlier, the most available solution on the that we have on our desk, which is let's go back to two states and all of the dogmas of the orthodoxies of the past, press the pause button and try to understand what went wrong and why we are where we are today. So that's, other than the accounting and the reckoning for the complicity and what happened, now there should be a deeper reflection about everything from what should be the objective that's pursued, with what actors, in what methodology, and who should the outside parties be. I think we're not, and people tell me, well, we need an answer. We need a blueprint of how we're going to get somewhere now. And our answer is, unfortunately, it's not as if peace is about to explode. We're not about to get a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So when people are rushing to say, this initiative or that initiative, it's so disconnected from reality. It's so untethered from the dynamics on the ground, from the fact that we're not about to get a solution. Why not take this time to have that deeper examination of everything that went wrong and try to be more creative and more courageous about a way forward? Again, the main protagonists in that are going to be Israelis and Palestinians, who are going to have to work back on the long march to finding some kind of common language, some kind of common vision. But the outside actors as well, who've been so inept and so ineffective at bringing the two parties closer to solution, they too should use this time to think and to try maybe to encourage a conversation between Israelis and Palestinians, not officials, but sort of the more unofficial contacts between Israelis and Palestinians, to try to invent something that is more likely to bring about a peaceful outcome than everything that's been tried in the past. So I understand the rush to find a quick fix. Is not going to be a quick fix right now. It's going to take time. It's going to be painful. But rather than simply rush and repeat the errors of the past, learn from them.
So we're getting close to the end. Bob or Nicole? Otherwise, I'll ask the final one.
I have one question I'd love to ask.
Please.
And that is, which isn't emphasized too much in your book, and that is, how about more of a focus on economics and improving the day-to-day lives of Palestinians?
So thanks for that question. And part of it is because that has been one of the themes of, going back to the origin of the peace process, Palestinian development, economic peace. If Palestinians could live better, then maybe they would give up. I'm not saying that's what you're intimating, but some have said they would give up some of their more historical grievances. I remember during the first Trump administration, a senior official invited me to the White House. Sure why, but started asking me questions about how the Palestinians would react to the ideas. As you recall, the Trump plan was called From Peace to Prosperity. And the question was, why do Palestinians cling to these ideas, these narratives, these political aspirations, which are unrealistic, rather than simply focus on having a better life? Of course, everyone wants a better life, but dignity, respect for one's emotions and histories and feelings, that too matters day to day for people. That's as intrinsic, and that's always when people tell me that, I say, yeah, well, would we as Americans be prepared to sacrifice our sovereignty, freedom, whatever, because we're going to have a better life? So number one, it is proven to be virtually impossible under conditions of occupation to truly improve the lives of Palestinians when the Israelis control every element of their lives, because they simply because it's just the obstacles to that economic prosperity were there, but also because Palestinians cared about other things as well. And so, yes, I'm all in favor of Israelis and Palestinians, but Palestinians in particular, living better lives, and those in Gaza are going to need, and it's going to take, unfortunately, decades for them to resume anything that approximates a normal. But that's not a substitute for resolving what has been the engine of this conflict for decades now. So you're right, it's important, but because there's been so many illusory attempts to substitute economic well-being for a political, historical reckoning with the and the needs and the emotions of both sides. That's why we didn't spend as much time on it, because it has been, from the attempts of Salam Fayyad to the early attempts, as I said, of the peace process, and then the Trump administration, Netanyahu's idea of economic peace. Those have been part of this panoply of failures that we've been discussing for the last hour.
I want to turn this over to Nicole to close things out, but what I would like to say is just leave you both with profound thanks for sharing your views on this. And secondly, how much I look forward to you, given your extraordinary experience and position, in writing the as yet unwritten chapter of your book about, all right, what next would be most constructive in some level of detail. And I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Nicole, but really profoundly appreciation.
If I could thank the two of you, and also repeat that how much I've learned from both of you, and also learned when I was at Harvard Law School with Roger Fisher about that idea that negotiations are about understanding all sides of the equation, even the sides that seem the most difficult to understand, particularly.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. I can only echo what an incredible discussion. And Jim and Bob, thank you for your wonderful questions and fielding and concise questions. Everyone, we have in the chat a link to Rob's book, as well as his email address if you want to continue the conversation. And I will conclude in previewing our next three events, which are already on the calendar. One that we're going to sneak in just before the Thanksgiving holiday next week with Shannon Fletcher, and then a Kelman seminar in mid-December before we resume for the new year in January with David Hoffman. So we look forward to seeing you all at our next series of PON live events, or perhaps at one of our in-person or online trainings in Cambridge. Thank you again, Robert Malley and Bob Anukin and Jim Sabanius, and everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye.